we're going to talk a bit more about government as a factor in suppressing freedom, suppressing specifically freedom of speech. With respect to journalists, but I think to others as well. At the moment, I'm sorry to say, one of our speakers is absent, and we will try to make do without her. And actually, the good news is we will have a bit more time, and since I think our previous panelists are still with us, we might ask them to take a couple of questions if you wish to direct them that way as well. But let me turn to our second speaker, because our first speaker is also at the moment elsewhere. Vilma Petrash is a woman who has experienced firsthand this kind of repressive conduct on the part of the government, in her case of Venezuela. She was a journalist there. She, I think, clearly found that it was hazardous to her health, to say the least, to continue reporting truthfully and accurately on what was going on inside Venezuela, and was forced into exile. She now lives and works very productively, I'm happy to say, in South Florida, where she is reporting, producing, hosting television programs in Spanish language, and helping those in this country, I think, have an appreciation of just how serious is the problem, not just most immediately for the people of Venezuela, as Chavismo relentlessly crushes freedom in that country, but how it has metastasized elsewhere in the hemisphere, and through Chavez's alliances with most of the bad actors elsewhere, how it is translating into a great and growing danger to us all. So, Vilma Petrash, thank you very much for joining us. Why don't you come up, and as I say, we will take about 10 minutes and then bring up Claudia Rossett. Thank you, Vilma.
First of all, I want to thank everybody, and particularly Frank, because I met you in 2005 when I was just starting my life as a persecuted and exiled person in the United States. Now I have political asylum, and my kids have been protected by this country, something that I appreciate a lot. But to talk about this is always emotional. You know, I had a productive career in Venezuela. I was, yes, a journalist and a political analyst, a professor. And I was accused of many things, including the fact that I was the cousin of Mr. Bush, because I was promoting the knowledge of the United States. And I was a foreign policy analyst on North American issues. But the thing about Venezuela is that we have had a process that has lasted for 13 years already. And certainly I would say that the opposition hasn't been defeated. We have been struggling and we have learned from our mistakes. But the truth is the process has been advancing, okay? When we see what is going on since, let's say it's 2004, actually since before, because I was, for instance, in my case, when I was charged, was because I actually have a strong activism between 2001 and 2004, and I was charged as a civil rebel. And many people have been charged like that in Venezuela. So we have a lot of lives that have been politically destroyed by this regime. For instance, we have a case that some people forget. We have 20,000 workers of the oil industry that now cannot find a job in Venezuela. Many of them have gone to other countries, like for instance, they are helping now Colombia to develop the oil industry. So we have many people also in the Middle East working now, like in Bahrain, Dubai, for instance. We have people working in Canada, you know. So we have actually many exiled people, okay? We have exiled communities in Costa Rica, in Peru, in the United States, in Europe. So we have many people whose lives have been affected by this regime. And the thing that is that this continues. When I read, for instance, reports, like these reports of Reporters Without Borders, that says that Venezuela has improved, I say, I don't know where they're taking this information from. Improve what? Actually, when we see what is happening with freedom of expression in Venezuela, there is a lot of self-censorship in the media today. Many critical journalists have disappeared from the media, okay? For instance, Marta Colomina, she was a very critical journalist, an excellent professor in journalism, and now she doesn't have a show. Cesar Miguel Rondon, also a critical journalist. You know, he has radio and TV shows, and now he doesn't have a show either. Actually, I received many calls in Miami from my friends, my journalist friends, asking me to help them because they don't know if they will find a job in Venezuela anymore. Many of them are having a lot of trouble. So when we see this happening, and remember, we just have one channel, Globovisión, which is an open, it's not a cable channel. It's the only one that we have left. And they have like 6 open cases against them. The last one was like the $2.5 million fine because they actually said what was going on in a riot in a prison in Venezuela in June 2011. And because of that, they are under the threat of being closed. Actually, even the president of Globovisión, okay, Guillermo Zuluaga, is now into exile together with his son in Miami. So we have cases like that happening, okay? So when we see that Venezuela has improved, actually what has improved is the fact that the press has been self-censored, and therefore they don't say what they have to say anymore. More of the media, like 94%, is actually today in the hands of the Chavismo, okay? And even though in that case, and let me explain to you something that happened. In 2010, at the end of the process of the Chavista Assembly, that was actually defeated because the opposition now has like 67 seats in the assembly, okay? At the last time, in the last minutes they have, the last days they had, they passed amendments and they passed changes to laws that were already in place, like the law for the social responsibility of television and radio. Now it includes the internet. You know why? Because we have migrated to the internet. You know, the opposition actually is using Twitter and Facebook, so the social media has become very important. So they decided to censor the internet. So what we see now is actually a process in which certainly the opposition is struggling and actually is making inroads to regain democratic spaces in a country or in a system that is not democratic. So actually it's a very asymmetrical struggle, okay? Because also we don't have the media to inform the people. And even though, and I have to say there is hope, Frank, there is hope. 3 million people voted in the primaries of the opposition. And I would say this is actually sickening more Mr. Chavez than his cancer. And I am not joking about that. I'm very sad that the guy is sick, I have to say, because we are human and we don't, it's a very terrible sickness. But I would say that the fact that the opposition is putting the game together in spite of all these big situation of lack of freedoms and persecution is something that has to be admired, because we have been quite alone in our struggle. I also have to say something else regarding political persecution, because this is another part. Yes, there has been political persecution in Venezuela against the Catholic Church, the Catholic authorities. They have been accused of conspirator, of that they had coup plotters, that they had tried to kill the president, for instance, that the Vatican and the Church are conspiring against the revolution, of course. And the property and, you know, the churches have been vandalized also. But probably the most ugliest case, the ugliest case that we have regarding persecution in Venezuela has been anti-Semitism. We have a community that was very patriotic, I have to say, very committed to Venezuela, had been living there for 200 years. And now they were 25,000 people in 1998. Now they are less than 9,000 people. They have left the country because they had been object to hate crimes, yes. For instance, the Mightier synagogue was so badly vandalized in January 2009, and still we don't have a responsible for that. Nobody has been prosecuted for that, okay? On the other hand, we have lately many examples of anti-Semitism, but we have lately the case of, for instance, Enrique Capriles Radonsky. He is the candidate of the opposition that won in the primaries because his grandparents are Jewish, or were Jewish, okay, and they migrated from, actually, his great-grandparents died in Treblinka. Because of that, because of his Jewish roots, he has been called a pig by the president. He has been insulted. He has been called a Zionist, right-winger, okay? So we have a policy also in Venezuela on behalf of the government, well, we could say this is an official anti-Semitic policy. As you know, we don't have a relationship with Israel because the ambassador and seats of the members of the embassy were expelled in June 2009. So what we are seeing now is a policy also that is against this particular minority. Of course, the government of Chavez uses anti-Semitism to go against the empire because they say, you know, actually what is behind this genocidal policy of Israel is the empire, the United States. So they are using that and against the rich people in Venezuela because they have the presumption, which is not true, that all Jewish in Venezuela are rich, okay? So what we are seeing is a case in which we don't have freedoms, we don't have freedom of the press. This is not true, so I don't agree with this index, I have to tell you. I don't agree with that. We have presidents of the media into exile, not just Mr. Zuluaga that lives in Miami, but also the director of another important journal, Rafael Poleo, and his daughter, Patricia Poleo, both journalists, they are into exile also in Miami. So we have people that have been obliged to leave the country because of their exercise as journalists. But we also have political persecution. We have people that have abandoned the nation, the country, and now, believe it or not, they are in Colombia also, the Jewish community are in Colombia, being productive there. They have been received there because they cannot live in Venezuela anymore. So what I would say is, yes, we have a situation, it's a difficult one. We have a very moving struggle on behalf of the opposition. We have been on our own, I have to say that. We don't expect the international community to help us, but we are still struggling. And I hope to have the chance to go back to Venezuela when we have the freedom and my kids can be raised in a free society like we were before 1998. Thank you very much.
Vilma, thank you very much. Let me just make an announcement because I will forget to do it probably if I don't do it now. This is, of course, one of a number of events that we do in New York. Part of it, a board of regents. We have a number of our regents here. I'm very happy to have them with us. We also do an event in May this year, the 22nd of May. Specifically, we will be extending another award, our Freedom Flame Award, to the Attorney General of the United States, Michael Mukasey. And we hope that you might be with us for that. He is an absolutely extraordinary man. He will be introduced by an old friend and colleague of his, Andy McCarthy, I'm very happy to say, and it will be a wonderful evening on the 22nd of May, so please be with us if you can. Let me introduce now Claudia Rossett, another recipient of our awards here. Andy McCarthy, of course, the first up today, received the Mightier pen a few years ago, as did Claudia Rossett. Claudia is a journalist's journalist, I think. She has worked on a number of continents in very difficult places, including the Moscow bureau of the Wall Street Journal. During Soviet times, she was based in Hong Kong as an editorial writer for the Asian Wall Street Journal. As it was being surrendered to the communists, she has reported from inside North Korea about the slave labor camps there. She has been the driving force, I think, behind one of the textbook cases. I hope it's taught as a textbook case in journalism schools, if they teach anything of use in those schools these days. Her oil for food revelations, the scandalous abuse of the United Nations by Saddam Hussein back in his day. She is the author of the Rossett Report blog. She has a column at Forbes.com. She also blogs for PJ Media. She is an award-winning journalist, but it's not just the high regard that her colleagues have for her. It is also the high regard that I think the rest of us do as well. She is now a resident journalist at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy and a dear friend and colleague of ours, and a person who really knows from firsthand hard experience about what it's like to deal with state-sponsored repression of journalists and other practice of free speech. So come practice it with us, Claudia. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Frank. Wonderful to be here, and in really, really, really good company. Thank you. Frank gave us such a broad brief to talk about escalating violence, state violence against political and religious expression, that I felt I was being invited to talk about almost anything. So I'm going to mostly tell you a few stories, but let me start with the statistics on escalating violence, because the Center for Security Policy emailed us some of the current statistics, which are appalling. And at the same time, I began looking through more of the statistics. The statistics will tell you all sorts of things, including if you look at the freedom status 1972 to 2011 of the world, it looks a lot better. What to make of the statistics? I like them. They're useful in writing stories. But perhaps story number one is about what was for me really the defining moment in journalism. I mean, literally in which it was defined for me, sort of in action. And I take you back to, the year was 1989, and it was the morning of June 4th in Beijing. The Chinese army had just occupied Tiananmen Square. And I had been there that night, seeing what was happening, and got back to my hotel with the story. And I called my editor back in Brooklyn, one of the two genius editors I've worked for, had the privilege of working for in my lifetime, Bob Bartley, and said, well, you know, I have a story. He said, let me put on a cassette in case they cut the telephone communications, so we've got it before you, but then you can go type it up. And he said, and this was the number one lesson of journalism, start with the high points. So I did, and I told him what I had just seen, fact by fact. And then he said, and this was the really important question, so what does it mean? And I sat on the phone, and I thought I had just witnessed the world's most populous communist state, with people rising up in the streets, possessing their own city, defying the military for 2 weeks. The military has just rolled in and shot people down in the street to occupy this incredibly symbolic square with the world watching. What does it mean? I thought, well, you really need to go to Dostoevsky, because at some point this is all about the struggles of humanity. This means, but I was a journalist and I had a deadline that afternoon, so what it actually means is this is what was always there. We have just seen break out into highly visible public view with blood in the streets what the people of China have been living with for, at that point, 2 generations. And in fact, it's one of the odd things with statistics. If you look at the best estimates of the number of people who died on that night that the world remembers, they're utterly dwarfed by the number of people who died in China, their names never recorded, their deaths never witnessed, nothing ever seen, but by way of the same state violence that the world had finally seen when those soldiers came in with their guns and armored personnel carriers and tanks, and people died in front of the CNN cameras. And this is one piece of what the statistics don't quite sum up. And the question that we all struggle with, because it is very hard to actually quantify, and it resides more in the realm of ideas. What is a good society? The things that the previous panel was discussing. What is it that actually makes a difference in the way that people lived? People remember Tiananmen, not really for the number killed. Burma had seen far, far more people gunned down the previous year, rising up to demand freedom in their country. Nobody really made that much of it. But this was fraught with meaning because that was the showdown was going on between communism and the free world. And in China, in this huge state, this incredible thing had happened. And people were calling something in the street over and over that I have remembered to this day. I have over my desk a sign in Arabic, actually, which I picked up in the streets of Beirut during their demonstrations in 2005. It says, "The truth." This is what people call for over and over when they rise up in one of these rebellions where it's covered in the news as state violence. It's what you just heard about Venezuela. The truth. Please tell the truth. Please tell the truth. Because what goes on in places where there is tremendous, I would say, seen and unseen violence are two kinds that we deal with. Implied violence. Violence where people die quietly in a gulag instead of in front of the cameras is the need to somehow tell the truth about what's really going on. I want to give, in a sense, part of what you try to discern is, are you seeing escalating violence or are you seeing escalating resistance? I promised my nephew Max Rosette over there a hat tip for that phrase. We were talking about it last night. I want to tell you, the next generation is here and there is great promise ahead. That is part of the difficulty that any journalist faces in trying to figure things out. It's part of the difficulty that anyone reading journalism faces in trying to figure what kind of journalism am I reading. And I stand in front of you as one of a really privileged class of journalists. I have an American passport. I come home to a place where I think there are great political troubles going on right now. But I have really never had to worry about being thrown in jail at home for the things I write. I may have to worry about lawsuits at some point, but in trying to assess what's going on or do something about it in the world, there is another story I'd like to tell you about journalism, and that is sort of the choices that get made. Back in 1990, this was a little after Tiananmen, I got to go on this boondoggle trip to a conference in Washington about women journalists. And they had summoned all these people, all these women from all over the world who were working in journalism. And the preoccupation of the hour I found when I got there was, were women getting enough bylines and enough front page stories, and were they getting paid as much as men? And I sat there because fresh in my mind was still what I had witnessed in China, which was just worlds removed. And next to me was sitting a woman from, as they were calling it at the time still, Leningrad, a Russian reporter, actually a Soviet reporter still. And she sat through these debates over bylines for women on page 1, and then she kind of leaned over to me and whispered, she said, "I have a problem, maybe you can help me." So what's your problem? She said, "I've been working as a journalist in," she called it St. Petersburg, in Leningrad for some time. And we have been trying for years, at great risk, to bring to the fore these reformers that we see, people who we think can change things. And they're beginning to get power. They're getting into positions where they can do something. The trouble is we're discovering that they are just as corrupt as the people that they are replacing. And we don't know what to do. Do we write about this? Do we not? I thought about that, and I realized I didn't actually have an answer. The answer I had was, you're the one who has to assess that. The truth is important, but you also have to weigh the risks that you will be taking. If you expose that, the thing is, my advice was, do not try to protect the people you are talking about, but do consider your own position in all this. And where we finally left it was, she said, by the way, do you know a good place where I can get a haircut while I'm in Washington? So yeah, why don't we go do that? These are some of the dilemmas that actually go on in places where people are trying to cover news who do not enjoy the privileges that we do out of this country. And again, in trying to respond to Frank's brief here, there's it becomes difficult to tell what is a journalist, what is somebody who's simply telling us what's going on in a country. I mean, I would kind of define a journalist as beyond somebody who's trying to report what happened and explain what it means, is they get paid for it and they are chewed out by editors, but there are fewer and fewer editors and less pay, so people do other things. Let me tell you about somebody who is not a journalist, but who died virtually unsung, and who did something that is part of the unseen protests, part of the things where states destroy people, and it never really gets traction. In Libya, which I watched with a certain, how to put this, when the rebellion really broke out, the uprising in Libya, the great discussion and dismay, I kept thinking of a Libyan dissident called Fatih el-Jami. He was never a journalist. In fact, he had been a governor of Benghazi province who dared to speak out against Gaddafi in the 90s. Okay, long before it suddenly became fashionable for those few brief months before they shot Gaddafi down near a drain pipe. He was thrown in one of the terrible prisons of Libya. He spent a couple of years there. He was let out for 3 weeks, spoke up again, was thrown back in again for 7 years, and never resurfaced. He was subjected to psychiatric drugs, Soviet style. His health was destroyed. He was finally shipped out comatose to Jordan in May of 2009. The State Department welcoming the fact that Libya had released him, in fact, surrounded by secret police, to die without ever regaining consciousness in Jordan. This was Libya's leading democratic dissident. And when people asked, where are the real Democrats of Libya, I actually had an answer. Well, there was one really good guy I knew about. He died 2 years before anybody started paying attention. And while Gaddafi was reigning at the UN with his stint of heading the General Assembly, sitting on the Security Council, sitting on the Human Rights Council, and nothing really got traction. You could write about that story. I wrote and wrote and wrote. It did not seem to change anything. Which brings me to, I have lots more stories I can tell, but a moment again with Bob Bartley, where in Hong Kong, when I was working in those days, Hong Kong was heading for a handover to China, which was sort of an appalling thing. Millions of people being handed over to this communist state, which had just finished gunning down its own citizens in its own capital. And Bob Bartley, my wonderful editor, came to visit in Hong Kong. And I said to him, we had breakfast, and I said, I am very discouraged. It's clear that Hong Kong needs some kind of democratic system of its own to elect its own leadership, or it will surely be sucked into the vortex that is China. And it's actually gone better than I had hoped, but it's not over yet. And so I write and write and write editorials warning about this, but I know that the fix is in. It's not going to change. Nothing I say is going to matter here. And Bob thought about that, and then he said, sometimes when you see a bus going over a cliff, you can't stop a bus going over a cliff. But you can say to everybody, hey, look, there's a bus going over a cliff. You may stop the next one. And this, in some sense, when we talk about escalating violence against journalists, what it is that journalists should be doing, it is not something that's easy to define by formula. It's something where the statistics are useful in writing about it or getting a handle on some things. But the question over and over again is, what does it mean? What stories are being told? There's kind of no easy out from having to think for yourself about it. One last note on the scene today. One thing that journalists or bloggers or whoever is reporting news does have going for them right now is technology. You know, we are all familiar with this, the astonishing scene in which video feeds are coming live during firefights in Syria, in which you can talk to people sitting in a prison in Kazakhstan. Yeah, I had that conversation some years ago on a mobile phone. That blew me away. Okay, part of the trouble there is, though, in some sense, we are, unless we find some will to act, we being the people on the other end, we're a bit in the position of that woman whose husband froze to death on the slopes of Mount Everest while talking to her on his satellite phone. She could hear all about it. Nothing saved him. Nothing changed it. And this is a moment when we know more about what's going on inside these societies, not only the ones where violence is erupting in the streets, as in Syria right now, but the ones where we don't really see it. I've included in the packet you've got a number of stories that just try to illustrate the things that don't necessarily make dramatic news. Yeah, what kind of implied violence does it take to require more than 1 million North Koreans to starve to death without rising up against their own government in the streets? But what you need on the receiving end is some will to act. In other words, this flood of information, we can see what's going on in Syria. We have a very good idea what's going on inside North Korea at this point. We have a very good idea inside all these societies. It's not that hard these days. What we are currently failing on is figuring out what does it mean, what do we actually do, which part of it matters. And this is a moment in which this country has an opportunity like never before to lead the world. People, when they take the risks that we're seeing, when they try to get news out, when they tell us what's going on, need an answering voice. It matters tremendously. So I'm going to end by saying the stakes over America's role in the world, leading from behind versus broadcasting the message that people need to live with the privileges that I personally have enjoyed all my life, and most of you have too. That's just vital. That's kind of my shaggy dog message about the state of escalating violence, and I welcome your questions later. Thank you.
Well, let's take a few questions for this wonderful panel. I apologize that our colleague Cynthia Farahat has somehow absented herself. We'll look forward to having her with us on another occasion. But you've been treated to two perspectives from people who've been reporting on the world, and I would welcome questions or comments put to either of them. Are there any? Yes, sir. Do we have a mic still? What has become of the mic? I'm sure you can be heard. I just wanted to see if everybody could have the benefit of the mic. It's not here. So, please.
So Claudia, you asked the right questions. You know, what does it mean? Why does it matter? What can be done? But there's a fourth question I'd like to address. That is, who could possibly do something about it? What is the audience for this message?
Just to repeat the question, there is a fourth question in addition to the three that Claudia put. Who's going to do something about it? And who could do something about it?
All of you here. The answer, that's the bus going over the cliff answer, is you may not succeed, but if you don't try, it may never happen. What can you do individually? What can the world do?
Who's the audience for this?
I think anyone who would listen. I'm not trying to persuade you all to become journalists or anything of the kind, but what I see more and more is a world in which statistics replace wisdom, in which we all look at the numbers, in which to get concrete about it. What's happening in Syria, whatever your view of the Sunnis there and what they might do if they overthrow Assad, is atrocious and reflects generations of atrocities being committed against these people. This is a country where they were employing the rack, as in medieval torture implements, to deal with their prisoners. It's in the State Department report. And somewhere in this, we get excited at the moment when violence erupts. Then it's all over the TV news and everybody debates and discusses it and does or doesn't do anything. And what I'm saying is, it's an idealistic message, is these things aren't simple and need real thought. That may seem very obvious, but it seems to me to be missing in a lot of today's debate. And I'm saying that if we go even a level deeper, there's an enormous problem in this country in that it is going missing. I see tremendous focus on statistics, on the evening news, on, oh look, Syrians are getting shot in the street. Well, a year ago, when they were getting killed quietly, our Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, was describing Assad as a reformer, quoting members of Congress to that effect, okay? A year ago, Asma al-Assad, the first lady of Syria, was featured on the cover of Vogue magazine, admired for her fashion taste and the happy times that she and her husband had playing with their children in the palace. And I don't know exactly where this will come from. I'm going to claim a most irritating prerogative here. I don't think it's the job of journalists to solve the problems of the world. I think that's a much more difficult task. I think it is the job of journalists to discern, to find, and to tell the truth, which is the part where they sometimes risk their lives. I have great admiration, for instance, for the people who are going into a place like Syria right now and are dying, to really tell the story professionally. But that is a part of it. The next step is there needs to be an answering voice. Where are the great statesmen in our society? Where is the man who will step forward in the primaries that are now going on and put forward a foreign policy that is not simply a laundry list, but a ringing declaration of principle at a very important time in the development of the world? The new order is being shaped now. Where are the people who will take these facts, these stories that the people on this panel try to find and say, here, the founding fathers did something with the information they had. We have vastly more information. Here's the sense to make of it.
Claudia,
So
can I
that's
ask
the
Vilma
audience.
to address this too? Because in a very specific sense, we're looking at an opportunity to do something.
Right.
You've mentioned the extraordinary courage of millions of Venezuelans to go vote and therefore be identified as opponents of the regime. There is a yawning silence, it seems to me, from our government, and for that matter, from probably most of us who are not aware of this playing out. But talk, if you would, in response to this question and more generally about the specific case of where something could be done and who the audience would be for doing that.
Okay, I want to play something to you. In Venezuela, for instance, we have a big crime rate, huge. 19,000 people were killed last year, okay? We are in a virtual civil war already, okay? What I would say is a war of the government and of the lack of policy of the government against the Venezuelan people. Many of the people that are dying are the poor that Chavez says is protecting, okay? And sometimes we don't know where is political violence or social violence. It could be both, because actually the government has been arming paramilitary groups. We have a lot of people with arms in the street, and some of them are revolutionaries. Like these people, the colectivos, like the La Piedrita, which is a paramilitary group that attack, the church in Venezuela, the Jewish community, and the church, the Catholic Church in Venezuela. And nothing happens. What do I want from journalists? To say the truth. I agree with you. To say the truth. Don't say that the situation in Venezuela is improving. In Venezuela, to be a journalist is a high-risk profession. Many of them are away from Venezuela or are working almost undercover because they know they have a fine because it's not just a fine for what you say as a journalist. It's the actual place where you work that one day can decide, you know what, you cannot work here anymore because we risk to be closed. And they have been closed, many of them, okay? We don't have freedom of the media now. And for us, it's a very, I say moving, I say lonely struggle, We have been alone in Venezuela. We have been criticized. And of course, we made many mistakes, because we actually were in the game of polarization with Chavez, you know? And the truth is, if we don't actually fight with him, he will be fighting alone. And that's terrible for him, because he is a fighter. You know, he needs to polarize. He needs to have a contender on the other side. So we decided to focus, okay, on recovering our democracy on a sustainable basis, because we know we made mistakes in the past. We don't want to go back to the past. We want to build a better, more equitable society. But the truth is, we need, yes, some support of the international community, not that much by the book. Yes, we have elections in Venezuela, but are they free elections? Do we have the opportunity of the people to be properly informed because they have the information? Or do we have, for instance, a government that respects the opposition? Okay, that actually allows us to have time on television, you know, to say what we offer to the Venezuelan people? We don't. And look what happened in the last legislative elections. Venezuela won with 52% of the votes. I'm saying the Venezuelan opposition. And we got only 67 of the seats, which means of the 152, which let me check the number well so I don't make mistakes with you, 165 seats, and we got 67 only. Because you know what they did? First of all, the electoral system has been deformed completely. We have a mixture of gerrymandering and malapportionment together. Okay? In which, for instance, if you vote in Barinas state, the state of the president, your vote is actually worthier because you have more chances to elect than if you vote in the populous state of Miranda. So that means one man is not one vote in certain places, in many places. So, I mean, what is this? The worst of the US system that has been trying to be changed, we have it, and nobody says anything. And they say, we compete under equal conditions. No, and still we have 3 million people voting under the risk of being threatened, of losing their jobs. Yes, and still, I believe so many people didn't vote because they were afraid. But 17% of the registered people to vote voted. That was impressive. And let me tell you something. All these people, the Chavistas, are so sick about this. So sick. You know, they have been attacking systematically and putting the whole machine of the state against the opposition, which actually is a new opposition because we are unified. We are unified for the first time, and we have a candidate that can actually challenge Mr. Chavez and recover democracy for all Venezuelans, okay? And the other thing is what happened with Mr. Capriles. As I told you, he's a Catholic, and he has been accused of being a Jewish pig by Chavez himself. Nobody's saying anything about that. Where is the U.S. position against that? Like saying openly, you know, that the government has a policy, an official policy of anti-Semitism that actually has destroyed the Jewish community in Venezuela. 25,000 people in 1998, 9,000 people now, and decreasing. Who is doing anything about that? So yes, I would like the media to report that, or at least to help us in saying the truth. Not saying like this, that, you know, he's improving, because now we have self-censorship. People are not saying the truth in Venezuela because they are afraid. Don't say that we are improving. Actually, we are having a very asymmetrical struggle. And hopefully, we will defeat Mr. Chavez democratically. Okay?
Amen. Did you have a question? Bruce Gelb. Do we have a mic? Yes, we do. The mic has returned. David, right here. Ambassador Gelb. Thank you.
The question I've got has to do with Venezuela also. There was an extremely popular, very pro-American, very attractive, typically a vote-getting guy who had 3 attempts on his life, and he was the mayor of Chacao, Leopoldo Lopez. Suddenly, he was no longer a possible candidate to fight against Chavez. What happened to him?
What happened is that, you know, he was inhabilitated politically by the government, okay? because of supposed cases of corruption that were never proved. Mr. Lopez went to the Court of Human Rights, and he won the case against the government. And you know, the Supreme Court in Venezuela decided that it was inapplicable. They couldn't apply that decision, even though we signed these conventions. We're supposed to be abide by the ruling of the the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. That's why he knew he didn't have a chance, and he decided to support Enrique Capriles. He retired. He dropped from the competition, from the contest, the primary elections on January, and supported Mr. Capriles. That's what happened to him.
Question? Yes, ma'am.
If the panel could comment on the spread of Islam in South America, specifically Venezuela, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Iran, and Hezbollah's reach?
Well, I could comment
Please.
on that. Actually, Mr. Chavez, as you know, is a good friend of Bashar al-Assad. He was a good friend of Mr. Gaddafi. Actually, he admired them, okay? Supposedly because he wants to replicate what they had been doing, or what they did. Okay, he also is a very good friend of Ahmadinejad, okay? Since 2004, he has promoted strong contacts, very strong links with Ahmadinejad, and also we have a chapter of Hezbollah in Venezuela operating, okay? In the border with the Indian communities, you know, in Venezuela, the native communities of the country, and also they are recruiting people. They have a presence. We have information, and finally in the U.S. Congress they are saying that we have a flight that is almost a daily flight, in which we have many people coming from Venezuela, and they have a Damascus, Iran, Syria, Venezuela trip. We know for other thing that you're supposed to know, probably you know that already, that the identity of the Venezuelans now is in the hands of the Cubans, okay? The Cuban regime, the Castro regime. So we don't know if these people are getting passport. They have identities as Venezuelans, and they could be, I don't know, getting this documentation to come to the United States as Venezuelans. So we don't know what is going on. You see what happened with the Venezuelan consulate in Miami. It has to be closed because there was proof that they were actually spying against U.S. interests, including nuclear reactors and information like that on the United States. So I would say this is a very dangerous situation. We have people very, very important here, like, good analysts like Douglas Farah, okay, and Roger Noriega. They have been working and doing this work of denouncing. I hope they are taken seriously by the U.S. government, because actually Ahmadinejad, Iran, Hezbollah, all these groups and governments are working through Venezuela to actually orchestrate probably, I don't know, attacks against the United States or U.S. interests, okay?
Yeah, that's the point I was going to make, is that it's not just that they were spying. These journalists in Univision, I think it was, captured a woman now with the consulate, or was formerly with the consulate before it was closed, actually conspiring with Iranian diplomats and what they believed were people who were plotting attacks on those nuclear reactors in the United States. So this is an extraordinarily dangerous situation. We have several more questions, and we're running out of time. Andy McCarthy? So brief question. And
yep. I was wondering, Vilma, if you could address the reaction in Venezuela to the Obama administration's policy with respect to Zelaya in Honduras, and maybe to extend that to Claudia, the difference in reporting in places when the United States is speaking out strongly in behalf of freedom and liberty and real American principles versus accommodation or just going silent.
Okay, I don't know if I got it well.
The question was to address the response of the Venezuelans to the Zelaya business in Honduras, and how that impacted, how the opposition, and for that matter, I guess the government really have behaved. And specifically, beyond that, Claudia, to what extent does it make a difference when our government does not stand for freedom?
What happened with the Zelaya thing is, I would say that I don't know exactly what is going on now with the Lobo government, but Venezuelans, the opposition, knew from the moment that Micheletti and his people stopped what was going on. We didn't interpret that. I mean, I know they didn't use a standard operating procedure. You know, taking the president on pajamas, you know, to Costa Rica is not like normal. But we knew that actually Zelaya was doing what we call a coup against the state. I don't know if you understand the difference. Coup d'etat, one thing, you know,
might
with
just
my more
remind
traditional.
people what actually happened very quickly.
Okay, what happened is, you know, Zelaya was trying to have a cuarta urna in order to install a constitutional assembly and go against the constitution that, according to the constitution, couldn't be reformed that way. It was unconstitutional what he was doing. So
This was the president of
yes,
Honduras
he was
at the
the
time,
president
Zelaya.
of Honduras at that time. So Micheletti, who was the president of Congress, together with the Supreme Court, decided to act. And at the end, when they have a decision to avoid that election from happening, the military decided to actually take Mr. Zelaya and take him out of the country, you know, in pajamas, you know that. Everybody knows that was very pintoresco, no, to say the least. But the truth is, at the end, that stopped that process from happening, and I actually was invited as an observer to what happened with the election of Mr. Lobo. So it was a very interesting process of stopping, you know, communism and stopping also the alliance of narco-traffic that Mr. Zelaya had. I don't mean to say this is over, because you know what is happening with journalists in Honduras. They are being killed because narco-traffic is a problem, and many Hondurans know that this is because of Zelaya and his openness towards narco-traffic. Okay, so, but I would say it was a very interesting process, and from that moment on, the process of we knew in the opposition side that we can win when taking certain procedures, not in terms of doing the hard way with Mr. Chavez, but keeping the struggle just like the Honduras did. They did stop the institutions in that case. They did stop Mr. Zelaya. In our case, it's the opposition learning from that and from their own mistake to not just stop, but to recover democratic space and eventually defeat Mr. Chavez.
Claudia?
It matters just enormously what the United States does. I mean, and what the president does in particular. The American president still has the world's bully pulpit. And what he says or doesn't say echoes hugely. And the story, as they call it these days, the narrative, when you hear, oh, well, the president should not be too forward because everybody will then resent America as the crushing imperial power. Remember, that is usually the voice of the state-controlled media coming from countries where the local dictators do not like when a Ronald Reagan says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, or when a Bush steps forward and says, the Middle East needs democracy, or they don't want to hear that. There is a silent majority out there, you know, in the rest of the world, the same way there is in a lot of other places. You run into them when you talk with them on the street. You run into them. There was a scene years ago where somebody shot a rocket launch grenade into the American embassy in Moscow, and there was a little demonstration going on the street in front of it. Nobody got hurt. It hit a wall by a big Xerox machine, emblem of bureaucracy. But there were these hardline nationalists, you know, shouting death to America things in front, and I stopped one of them and said, could I interview you for a minute? And he said, oh, you're American. I have a brother in America. Yeah, everybody can tell you these stories. I said, why are you doing this? He said, it's what I do. Yes, okay. But it matters enormously when America steps up to the plate and says this matters. It is the difference between tear down this wall and leading from behind. And in the questions that are coming out now over what will happen with this, whatever you want to call it, Arab Spring, Arab eruption, Arab winter, the immense visible upheaval going on in the Middle East, one thing that America is neglecting abysmally to do is, and it's terribly important, is say, here is where we want this to go. In the discussion of what the endless debates that went on about 10 years ago over who lost Russia, Dmitry Simes said something that I thought there was great truth to. He said, we were so busy worrying about what we thought they needed that we forgot to tell them what we need. What we need are democratic partners, decent, peaceful societies we can traffic with. I could spend the day talking about how we defer to things like the UN these days, which is in no way represents anything like the values on which America is built. It is a collective representing 193 states that has to be extensive enough to include North Korea and Iran. And just, well, does it matter? People hear this. When people are fighting for their lives in the kind of scene that you've just been describing, or the kind of thing where they have had enough of whatever dictatorship, so that they finally said, there comes a moment, some catalyzing moment, when people have lived with it and died under it and been in Syria, the society that the Ba'ath Party has been running there is one in which your own family members are required to inform on you. Imagine what that does to your home life or the rest of your life. There comes a moment when something breaks the isolation. This is where journalism can be very important. That's one of the critical tools of any dictatorship, is people are afraid to talk to each other. And somehow the messages start to go back and forth. And there is tremendous potential for, everything is suddenly very volatile. That's the what does it mean question. What is now in the crucible? Which way can this go? When the right words can make an enormous difference, when it matters. And let me just end this long comment to give you a little story. I don't know that this has changed the world yet, but these things are cumulative. When I was working at the Asian Wall Street Journal in Hong Kong, there was then a Chinese dissident who had already been serving quite some time in solitary in China. This was back in the 80s. There was no internet, really. And there was no news of him. We didn't even know if he was alive. This guy was named Wei Jingsheng. He was an electrician who had posted in 1979 a democracy essay on a wall near Beijing University. And his essay argued that China is going through what is officially called the 4 modernizations, science, this and that. We will never be a modern country until we have the 5th modernization, democracy. For this, they accused him of being a Vietnamese spy and threw him in the clink for 15 years. And that's where he was when I arrived in Hong Kong. And my wise other genius editor of those days, Seth Lipsky, said to me, every year the journal runs these same editorials. You read them at Christmas, on the road to Damascus. In Asia, that's not so relevant. Let's do one for Asia. I said, let's run on the first publishing day of every new year, Wei Jingsheng's essay on the 5th modernization, democracy. And so we began doing that. Every year, that would be our traditional Asian essay. Well, the years went by. Wei Jingsheng was finally let out briefly, and then he spoke up again, and they threw him back in, and finally they kicked him out of China. And he arrived in America about 10 years ago, a little more. And I got in touch with someone who knew where to find him and asked him if he would come over for lunch. And to my great delight, he did. And he's an amazing man. You have to be a little bit crazy to do what he did. All of these people are, and at the same time, it's crazy in a good way. And he brought me this very strange-looking creamer, like for pouring cream. This little dragon thing that he'd actually received as a gift for some speech. And he said, I want to bring you a gift, because when I was in solitary confinement in China, I thought that the whole world had forgotten me, and it was devastating. Then somebody got word to me that the Asian Wall Street Journal every year had started running my essay. He said, you have no idea how much that means. Wow. And over and over, when Reagan said, tear down this wall, when if during the crisis in Honduras, if the president here, instead of taking the other side, had said, huge things are at stake. If on Venezuela, the president would now step forward and say, this is a vital thing. Frank, may I add one more thing on that? It's not like they don't know. Quickly. In 2009, Bob Morgenthau, the legendary former DA of New York, no Republican, he was a Democrat all his life. His father was a Democrat. He loves the Democrats, okay? A great DA. He, for his swan song speech while he was still in his job, went down to Washington to warn about what was happening in Venezuela. He has plenty of press space in New York. It's his home turf. He didn't do it in New York. He went to Washington, where he could be right down the street from the president and the Congress and the people who make our foreign policy. And he said they are trucking Iranian military equipment into Venezuela. They are building installations in places we can't see. He talked about all these threats. They have Middle Eastern officials in the government He said we are heading for the next Cuban Missile Crisis on a worse scale. And then he packed up and came back to New York, and here we are 2.5 years later, you're saying the same things. It's still unaddressed. It matters.